Folks, gather round, because the story I'm about to tell you is one that digs its roots deep into the heart of the American West, a place where the dust never settles and the truth is often buried just beneath the surface. It's a story about a woman who ran from a fire, only to find herself walking into another one. It's about a man who belonged to two worlds and to none at all. And it starts, as so many of these tales do, with a promise on a piece of paper and the whistle of a lonely train. Eleanora Nora Whitman felt the train shudder to a halt, the squeal of iron on iron like a scream in the vast, empty quiet of the Arizona Territory. She clutched the letter in her pocket, the paper worn soft as old cloth. It was her ticket to a new life, a future signed by a man named Thomas Gray. A good, steady name, an honest name, the kind of name you could build a life on. She stepped onto the dusty platform, and the world seemed to tilt. The heat was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that smelled of baked earth and something wild. The town of Dust Devil wasn't much more than a scar on the landscape, a handful of weathered buildings huddled together as if for protection against the endless sky. This was it, spring of 1875, a place where a woman's past could be shed like a snake's skin. The depot master, a woman with a face like a clenched fist, gave her a single dismissive glance. "No rooms here, miss," she said, her voice flat and final. "This is a respectable place." The words were a slap, a clear sign that Nora, with her travel-worn dress and the ghost of scandal in her eyes, was already judged, already condemned. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. She was alone, utterly and completely alone. She scanned the platform for the man from the letters. Thomas Gray. He described himself as a simple man, a farmer with kind eyes and a sturdy build. She pictured a man in a clean shirt, hands calloused from honest work. But there was no one like that here. There was only a lean figure sitting atop a chestnut horse, still as a statue carved from the red rock itself. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing worn leather and moccasins. His skin was the color of the sun-scorched earth, his hair long and black, his cheekbones high and sharp. He watched her with eyes that held the patience of the mountains. This couldn't be him. It was a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. Before she could retreat, before she could run back to the train that was already hissing and preparing for its eastward journey, the man swung down from his horse. He moved with a silent grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. He stopped a few feet from her. The air grew thick. Everyone on the platform stopped to watch. "You are Miss Whitman?" he asked. His voice was low, a rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth, with an accent she couldn't place. Nora's knuckles were white where she gripped her travel bag. She could only nod. "You are Thomas Gray." The name felt foreign and foolish on her tongue. He gave a slight tip of his head, not quite a nod. "That was the name I gave." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "My name is Toshin." Toshin. The name hit her like a physical blow. It wasn't just a different name, it was a different world. In her mind, she had married a simple farmer named Thomas, but the man standing before her was half Apache, half shadow, a man from the very wilderness she'd been taught to fear. Whispers erupted around them, sharp and cruel. "That Apache's got himself a mail-order bride." The words weren't just unkind, they were venomous. Nora felt a hot flush of shame and fear creep up her neck. She had been bought, not by the man in the letters, but by this stranger, this outcast. What kind of trap had she walked into? She had run from one hell, only to find herself at the gates of another. Toshin seemed not to hear the whispers. He simply brought his horse closer and held out the reins to her. "Come," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at the departing train, then back at the silent, watchful man. There was no going back. There was nothing to go back to. With a tremor in her hands that she prayed he couldn't see, she took the reins. He lifted her into the saddle behind him as if she weighed nothing. As they rode out of Dust Devil, leaving the accusing stares behind, Nora felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. The letter in her pocket, the one that had promised her safety and a new beginning, now felt like the first page of her obituary. The man whose back she was pressed against was a complete mystery, and his silence was more terrifying than any threat. The ride from the station stretched into an eternity of dust and silence. For nearly 2 hours, Toshin spoke not a single word. Nora's mind raced with 1,000 frantic questions. Was he a savage? A kidnapper? Had she just made the biggest mistake of her life? Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a warning. Finally, they crested a ridge that overlooked the San Pedro River, a ribbon of shimmering silver winding through the canyon below. It rained last night, he said, his voice startling her out of her terrified thoughts. Makes the river high. She looked down at the rushing water, a powerful, untamed force of nature, just like the man in front of her. The sky is clear now, she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded. Morning sunlight makes hard things look different. His words were strange, layered with a meaning she couldn't quite grasp. They weren't polite, they weren't cruel. They were just true. She had to know. She had to ask. I didn't expect an Apache, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush of fear and confusion. She had expected a man shaped by newspaper ads and polite letters, not one carved from red clay and relentless sun. Toshin glanced back at her, his expression unreadable. I wasn't sure you'd stay once you saw me. The honesty of it disarmed her. He wasn't apologizing. He was stating a fact. He was giving her a choice she didn't know she had. I thought I should stay, she said, surprising herself, to see. In that moment, she admitted a truth she hadn't even confessed to herself. She didn't want the perfect, polished life she'd pretended to seek. She wanted a place that didn't demand perfection. She wanted something real. Silence fell between them again, but this time it felt different, less threatening. They rode down a narrow trail, and she held on to his waist, feeling the steady strength of him. He led them to a small log cabin tucked by the riverbank, with smoke curling from a stone chimney. It was small, isolated, but it looked solid. It looked like a home. He helped her down, his hands gentle on her waist. She landed in the dust, feeling the weight of her decision settle in her chest. It isn't much, he said quietly, nodding toward the cabin. But it's mine. She stepped inside. The air was warm, smelling of pine and cedar. It was a single room, brutally simple. A table, a hearth, a few shelves with well-used pots. A single window framed the vast, empty horizon. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean. It was honest. She placed her letter on the table, the folded paper that had led her here. It had promised her a husband, but it had told her nothing about the man. She looked up and met Toshin's steady gaze. Thank you, she said. He gave that same slight tip of his head, a gesture that seemed to hold miles of unspoken meaning. He pointed to a small, curtained-off alcove. That room is yours, he said. There's water on the shelf. He was giving her a separate room. He wasn't going to touch her. The relief was so profound it almost made her knees buckle. He was a stranger, yes, but perhaps he wasn't a monster. As he turned to leave her to her privacy, he paused at the door. The man you wrote to, he said, his back still to her. Thomas Gray, he is not here anymore. A chill went down Nora's spine. Not here anymore? What did that mean? Was he dead? Had Toshin done something to him? Before she could ask, he was gone, leaving her alone in the quiet cabin with a new, terrifying question hanging in the air. Who was the real Thomas Gray, and what had happened to him? The first morning Nora woke to the murmur of the river and the scent of damp cedar. She had slept fitfully, haunted by the question of Thomas Gray. She half expected to find herself locked in, a prisoner, but the door was unlatched. Outside, the world was washed in the clean, sharp light of dawn. Toshin was already awake, chopping wood with a powerful, rhythmic swing of his axe. He paused when he saw her, his face betraying no surprise. Slept all right? He asked. She just nodded, pulling her shawl tighter. Her eyes were drawn to a trio of young cottonwood trees planted by the riverbank. They were small and fragile-looking, each one staked with care. You planted those? She asked, her voice quiet. He rested the axe against a stump. 3 years ago, after the last flood. His gaze softened as he looked at them. Thought maybe they'd hold the bank together. They're growing, she observed. A flicker of something, pride maybe, crossed his face. They are. She needed to know. She couldn't let it go. Toshin, she said, her voice firmer now. What did you mean last night? About Thomas Gray? He turned to face her fully, his expression closing off. It doesn't matter. It matters to me, she insisted. I came here to marry him. I came here because of his words, his promises. He was silent for a long moment, the only sound the rushing of the river. The words were not his. Nora felt her stomach drop. What are you saying? Thomas Gray couldn't write his own name, Toshin said, his voice low and flat. He was a prospector, a good man. He got sick last winter. The fever took him fast. So he was dead. The man she was supposed to marry was dead. Then who wrote the letters? She whispered, horrified. Toshin picked up his axe again, avoiding her eyes. Doesn't matter who wrote them. Matters who sent for you. Before she could process this new mystery, a voice, sharp as a shard of glass, cut through the morning air. You won't last a week. Nora spun around. Perched on the fence like a small, wiry bird was a young girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old. She had straight black hair in 2 tight braids and eyes that were far too old for her face. I give you till the first hard frost, the girl continued, grinning a mischievous, gap-toothed grin. Then you'll run back east like all the others. Nora, flustered and angry, brushed the dust from her skirt. And who might you be? Luca, the girl said, hopping down from the fence. My mama was Mexican. My daddy was Apache. Both gone now. Toshin feeds me sometimes. She looked Nora up and down with a critical eye. He feels sorry for strays. The insult stung, but there was a strange honesty in the girl's gaze. So, you're an expert on who lasts out here? Nora challenged. Yep, Luca said, popping the pea. And women who come looking for something that ain't here? They're the first to break. She gestured toward the cabin with her chin. Heard you asking about the letters, about who wrote them. What do you know about it? Nora asked, her heart starting to pound again. Luca's grin widened. I know Toshin didn't write them. He can't write English that pretty. She kicked at a stone with her bare foot. But I know who can. The man who owns half this valley. The man who wanted a bride of his own. A cold dread, worse than anything she had felt yet, washed over Nora. What man? Mr. Kane, Luca said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Virgil Kane. He's rich and he's mean. And he's the one who wrote you all those pretty promises. Nora felt the world sway. She pulled the letter from her pocket, the familiar handwriting suddenly looking monstrous. Alien. She hadn't been corresponding with a kind farmer or even with Toshin. She had been writing to a complete stranger, a powerful man Luca called mean. Why? Why would this Virgil Kane write to her as Thomas Gray? And why would Toshin bring her here, to this isolated cabin, knowing the truth? Was he protecting her? Or had he stolen her? The lies were piling up, one on top of the other, and Nora was trapped in the middle of them, with a silent Apache and a wild-eyed girl as her only companions. Out here in the middle of nowhere, a woman could disappear, and no one would ever know who to blame. The name Virgil Kane hung in the air, heavy and menacing. Nora turned on Toshin, the crumpled letter shaking in her hand. Is it true? Did this Virgil Kane write to me? Toshin finally set down his axe and met her gaze. The silence was his confession. Why? Nora demanded, her voice rising with a frantic edge. Why would he pretend to be Thomas Gray? And why would you bring me here? Kane owns the biggest ranch in this valley, Toshin said, his voice still infuriatingly calm. He thinks he owns the people in it too. He places ads in Eastern papers, luring women out here with sweet words and promises of a good life. And what happens to them? Nora whispered, dreading the answer. They become his property. He works them like animals. And when he's tired of them, they disappear. The casual horror of his words chilled her to the bone. And you knew this? You let me walk into this? I've been intercepting his mail for a year, Toshin explained, warning the women away, tearing up the letters. But yours was different. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something other than stoicism in his eyes. You sounded desperate, like you were running from something worse than a lonely life. He was right. She had been. But that didn't change the fact that he had deceived her. So you brought me here? To this prison? I brought you here to keep you safe, he countered. I figured when you saw me, you'd demand to be put on the next train east. I was going to give you my savings and send you to a city, somewhere Kane couldn't find you. I never expected you to stay. The confession left her breathless. He hadn't stolen her. He had rescued her. It was too much to comprehend. Her entire reality had been shattered and rebuilt in the span of a few minutes. As if summoned by the mention of his name, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the trail. A man on a magnificent black stallion rode into the clearing. He was handsome in a cruel, polished way, dressed in expensive clothes that were completely out of place in this rugged landscape. He dismounted with an easy arrogance, his cold blue eyes fixing on Nora. Well, well, he said, his voice a smooth, dangerous drawl. Look what the savage dragged in. It was Virgil Kane. He ignored Toshin completely, his predatory gaze locked on Nora. I believe you're the lovely Miss Whitman. I've been looking forward to our meeting. He gave a mocking bow. I am Thomas Gray. Nora flinched as if he'd struck her. This was the man whose words had given her hope. This snake. That's not your name, she said, her voice shaking but firm. Kane chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. A man can be whoever he needs to be to get what he wants, my dear. And I wanted you. He took a step closer. And it seems you have a rather interesting past. A fire, was it? In Ohio? A dead sister? Nora's blood ran cold. How could he possibly know that? The secret she had carried across a continent, the shame that had branded her, was being laid bare by this monster in the middle of the desert. A woman running from a murder accusation shouldn't be too picky about her saviors. Kane sneered. He then turned his attention to Toshin, his smile vanishing. She's my property. I paid her passage. Give her to me. She is not property, Toshin said, stepping between Nora and Kane. He didn't raise his voice, but his presence was a wall of solid rock. And she is not yours. Kane's hand drifted down to the pearl-handled pistol at his hip. Everything in this valley is mine for the taking. Half-breed, including her. The air crackled with tension. Nora stood frozen, trapped between two men who had both lied to her, both claiming some right to her future. One was a monster who knew her darkest secret, the other a silent stranger whose motives were still a mystery. Luca, who had been watching from the sidelines, suddenly darted forward and threw a rock, hitting Kane's horse in the flank. The stallion reared, snorting in panic, forcing Kane to stumble back. You stay away from her! The little girl shrieked, her face a mask of pure fury. Kane regained his composure, his face dark with rage. He looked from Luca to Toshin, then back to Nora. This isn't over, he spat. You're living on my land, savage. I can have you gone by morning. He swung back onto his horse. And you, my dear, he said, his eyes burning into Nora. I'll be back for you. You belong to me. He galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and a suffocating silence in his wake. Nora finally found her voice. He knows, she whispered to Toshin, her body trembling uncontrollably. He knows about the fire, about Annabelle. Toshin looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a gravity she was only beginning to understand. Out here, he said slowly, secrets are like seeds. You bury them, but they always find a way to the surface. She was trapped. Virgil Kane knew her secret, a secret that could get her hanged. He believed he owned her, and she was living in a tiny cabin with a man who was now her only protector, a man she barely knew, a man who stood in the way of the most powerful and dangerous figure in the valley. Running was no longer an option. She had nowhere left to run. The days following Virgil Kane's visit were thick with an unspoken tension. Nora felt like a cornered animal. She jumped at every sound, her eyes constantly scanning the ridgeline, expecting to see Kane and his men riding down to claim her. But they didn't come. The waiting was its own form of torture. She threw herself into work, needing the distraction. She scrubbed the cabin until the wood floors shone. She organized the shelves, mended Toshin's shirts, and, With Luca's skeptical guidance, she began to attack the weed-choked garden plot. "You're turning the soil all wrong," Luca would say, perched on the fence. But she would always end up hopping down, grabbing a hoe and working alongside Nora, her bare feet sinking into the cool earth. In the quiet rhythm of their work, an unlikely friendship began to form. Luca, with her sharp edges and fierce loyalty to Toshin, slowly began to thaw. She told Nora stories about the land, about which plants could heal and which could poison, about how to read the clouds for signs of rain. And Nora, for the first time in years, felt a flicker of something like peace. One afternoon, as they were pulling weeds, Luca grew quiet. "My parents," she said suddenly, not looking at Nora. "They didn't just die. Cain drove them off." Nora stopped her work. "What do you mean?" "They had a small farm, right where Cain's north pasture is now. He wanted the land. Said the creek running through it belonged to him. He diverted the water. Our crops died." Luca's voice was small but hard as a river stone. "My papa confronted him. The next week our barn burned down. We lost everything. Another fire." The word sent a familiar chill through Nora's veins. "They left," Luca continued, "headed for California. They told me they'd send for me when they got settled. But they never did." She shrugged, a gesture too small for the weight of her grief. "Toshin found me sleeping in the old mission. He brought me here." Now Nora understood the girl's fierce protectiveness, her immediate hatred of Virgil Cain. The man was a cancer on this valley, destroying everything he touched. That evening, Nora watched Toshin as he mended a piece of tack on the porch. He worked in silence, his hands sure and steady. He had saved her from Cain. He had given Luca a home. He fought his battles not with loud words, but with quiet persistence. "You should tell the sheriff about Cain," Nora said softly. "About what he did to Luca's family. About the women he brings here." Toshin didn't look up from his work. "Sheriff Miller gets his paycheck from Virgil Cain. He sees what Cain tells him to see." "So you do nothing?" she asked, a familiar frustration rising in her. "You just let him win?" "I stay," he said simply. "On this land. That is how I fight him." He finally looked at her, his gaze intense. "This land was my mother's. Her people were here before the lines were drawn on the maps. Cain says I'm a squatter. The law says he's right. But I stay." His words hung in the air. He wasn't just living here, he was making a stand. A quiet, stubborn rebellion against a world that had tried to erase him. The sky began to darken, the clouds on the horizon turning a bruised purple. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain and dust. A storm was coming, not just a storm of wind and water, but a storm of violence that had been brewing since the day she arrived. And she was standing right in the middle of it. The storm hit without warning, a sudden, furious onslaught. The wind screamed like a banshee, tearing at the roof of the cabin. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the world into a blur of gray. Nora rushed to the door, her heart pounding. Through the deluge, she saw Toshin sprinting toward the corral. The wind had ripped the gate from its hinges, and his two horses were bucking in terror. She didn't hesitate. Grabbing a heavy oilskin jacket, she ran out into the tempest. The rain was like icy needles against her skin, the wind trying to tear the jacket from her hands. "The tarp!" Toshin shouted over the roar of the storm. "Cover the feed!" Nora wrestled with the heavy waterlogged canvas, the wind whipping it like a sail. She finally managed to drag it over the feed sacks, anchoring the corners with heavy stones. Suddenly, a sickening crack echoed through the chaos. A heavy beam from the lean-to, weakened by the wind, snapped and crashed down, striking Toshin across the shoulder. He cried out and dropped to one knee, blood already staining his sleeve. "Toshin!" Nora screamed, rushing to his side. "It's nothing," he grunted, trying to get up. But she could see the pain in his eyes, the unnatural angle of his arm. Just then, Luca appeared out of the storm, her face pale with fear. "The fence line!" she yelled. "It's down! The mare is running for the river!" The three of them worked in a desperate, uncoordinated dance against the fury of the storm. Nora, her dress soaked and caked with mud, helped a grimacing Toshin get the second horse under control. Luca, small but fearless, scrambled to rig a temporary fence to keep the panicked mare from bolting into the raging river. By the time the storm finally passed, leaving a trail of broken branches and ankle-deep mud, The sun was setting. The world was battered, but whole. Inside the cabin, Nora cleaned and bandaged Toshin's wound. The gash was deep, and his shoulder was clearly dislocated. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she worked. "You could have been killed," she said, her voice tight with a mixture of anger and relief. "You just ran out there." "Wouldn't have mattered if I waited," he muttered, his jaw clenched in pain. "It would have mattered to me," she snapped. He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Her hair was plastered to her face, her dress was ruined, but her eyes were blazing with a fire he hadn't seen before. "You're not afraid," he said, a note of surprise in his voice. "I've been afraid before," she replied, her voice dropping. "This isn't the same." He leaned back, wincing as she tightened the bandage. "That fire," he said quietly, "the one you don't speak of. I see it in your eyes sometimes." She froze, the wet cloth in her hand. "I saw it once," he continued, his voice low and soft, "in a man who came back from the war. He'd survived. His house hadn't." The dam inside her finally broke. The story she had held captive for so long came pouring out in a torrent of grief and shame. "It was my husband," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "His name was Jeff." She told him everything, about the jealousy, the drinking, the rage, about the night he'd locked her in the house, convinced she was unfaithful, about the smell of oil, the terrifying sight of the match. "I got out through a back window," she said, her voice cracking, "but my younger sister, Annabelle, she was visiting. She was sleeping upstairs. I didn't know." Her gaze was fixed on the far wall, but she was seeing flames. "They said she died in her sleep from the smoke. I pray to God that's true." She finally looked at him, tears streaming down her face. "At the funeral, my own father looked at me like I was the one who lit the match, like I was the fire." "So you ran," Toshin said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. "I ran to a place where no one knew my name," she choked out. He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached out, his good hand covering hers. It was the first time he had touched her voluntarily. His touch was warm, steady. "Names matter out here," he said softly, "but not the ones people give you, the ones you earn." "And what name have you earned?" she asked, her voice thick with tears. "I've been called half-breed," he said, his eyes holding hers. "Stray, traitor, by my people and by yours." "What name would you give yourself?" she pressed. He considered it for a moment. "Builder," he said finally. "Not of houses, of peace, if it can be done." They sat in silence as the last light faded from the sky. The storm was over, but something had broken open between them. The secrets were out. The wounds were exposed. Before he limped off to his bed, he turned to her. "Kane's men cut the corral gate," he said, "and they weakened the beam on the lean-to. The storm was just their cover." Nora stared at him, horrified. This wasn't an accident. It was an attack, an attempt on his life. "They will be back," he said, "and next time, they won't fail." He left her standing there, the weight of his words pressing down on her. Virgil Kane wasn't just trying to intimidate them. He was trying to kill them, and she was right in the line of fire. The attack during the storm changed everything. The illusion of safety, fragile as it was completely shattered. Nora now understood that they were living on borrowed time. Every day that passed was a day Virgil Kane allowed them to live. The first Saturday of May brought the Dust Devil Spring Festival. The whole valley would be there for a town barbecue and dance. "You should go," Luca said, her eyes bright with excitement. "There's fiddles and pies." Nora shook her head. "I don't think that's a good idea." The thought of facing the judgmental townspeople, and worse, of running into Virgil Kane, made her stomach churn. "Toshin never goes," Luca said, her face falling. "People stare at him, or they just pretend he's not there." Later, Nora found Toshin by the river, trying to reset his dislocated shoulder against a tree. The pain was etched on his face, but he made no sound. "You're not going to the festival," she said. He shook his head, finally managing to pop the joint back into place with a sickening thud. He leaned against the tree, breathing heavily. "No point in making myself an exhibit." "You wouldn't be an exhibit," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "You'd be a man." taking his wife. The word felt strange and foreign, but also undeniably right. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. I never asked you to call yourself that. No, she replied, but maybe I want to. She decided then. She would go. Not for the dancing or the pies, but to make a statement, to show Virgil Kane and the whole town that she was not afraid, that she would not be intimidated. She was Toshin's wife, and she belonged here, with him. She wore a simple blue dress that a kind shopkeeper had given her. Luca braided her hair, weaving in a few wild desert flowers. When Nora rode into town alone, a hush fell over the bustling square. People stared. They whispered. She could feel their judgment like a physical weight. She kept her chin high, walking through the crowd until she was accosted by a voice she had prayed she would not hear. Evening, Mrs. Gray, Virgil Kane said, blocking her path. He was dressed like a gentleman, but his eyes were those of a wolf. I have to say, you're a brave woman, choosing a man like that. He's more of a man than you'll ever be, Nora said, her voice cold as ice. Kane's smile tightened. You best remember which side of the river your safety lies on, my dear. I offered you a comfortable life. You chose a mud hut with a savage. A bad choice. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. A final choice. That's enough, Kane. The voice cut through the crowd like a knife. Toshin was standing at the edge of the square. He had come after all. He was wearing a clean white shirt, his injured arm in a sling, but he stood tall and unbowed. Kane turned, feigning surprise. Didn't see you there. You saw me, Toshin replied, his voice dangerously quiet. Now step away from my wife. The word wife echoed in the sudden silence. Every eye in the square was on them. It was a declaration of war. Kane laughed, a low, ugly sound. Wife? You think saying the word makes it true? She belongs to me. I have the letter, the contract. She is a free woman, Toshin said. She chose. Then she chose death, Kane hissed. He turned and stormed off, but the threat lingered in the air, thick and poisonous. Nora's hands were shaking. He has the letter, she whispered to Toshin. The one I signed. It's just paper, Toshin said, but they both knew it was more than that. In the eyes of the law, the prejudice law of this town, that piece of paper might as well be a brand on her skin. They didn't stay for the dance. As they rode home under a canopy of stars, a new terrifying thought began to form in Nora's mind. Kane had tried to kill Toshin. He had threatened her. What would he do next? He wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. And what he wanted was her. The attack came in the dead of night, a few weeks later. Nora woke to the smell first. Acrid smoke, sharp and sour, completely different from the familiar scent of their hearth. Her eyes flew open. An unnatural orange glow flickered against the window. Her blood ran cold. Fire. Toshan! She screamed, scrambling out of bed. He was already awake, pulling on his boots, his face a grim mask in the flickering light. It's the barn, he said, his voice tight. He's trying to burn us out. They burst out of the cabin into a scene from hell. The small barn and the feed shed were engulfed in flames, the fire roaring like a hungry beast, spitting embers into the dry grass. The wind was fanning the blaze, pushing it directly toward the cabin, toward them. Luca ran out behind them, her face streaked with tears and terror. It's Kane. I saw him. I saw him right away. They were trapped. The river was at their back, and a wall of fire was advancing in front of them. The buckets! Toshin yelled, his voice strained. To the river! They worked with a frantic, desperate energy, running back and forth from the river, throwing useless bucketfuls of water against a raging inferno. The heat was scorching, the smoke thick and suffocating. Nora's lungs burned, her eyes streamed, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The fire was moving too fast. It licked at the side of the cabin, the dry wood groaning as it began to smolder. We have to get out, Nora choked, grabbing Luca's hand. We have to run. There's nowhere to run, Toshin said, his face grim with resignation. The fire was spreading along the riverbank in both directions, cutting off any escape. Suddenly, a section of the barn roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. A flaming beam crashed down, blocking the path to the river. They were completely encircled by flames. Luca screamed, a high, terrified sound that was nearly lost in the roar of the fire. This was it. This was how it ended. Nora had escaped one fire only to die in another, trapped with the only two people in the world who had ever shown her true kindness. She looked at Toshin. His face was streaked with soot, his good arm burned, but his eyes were fixed on the flames with a look of fierce, unyielding defiance. "The cottonwoods," he said, his voice raspy. "The roots. They hold the bank." Nora didn't understand. What did the trees matter now? "The river is high," he went on, thinking aloud, his mind racing. "The bank is soft from the rain. If it gives way—" He was looking at the section of the river bank where he had planted his 3 small trees. It was their only chance. A desperate, insane chance. He grabbed his axe. "Help me!" he yelled at Nora. He began hacking at the base of the riverbank, not at the trees, but at the earth around them. The fire was just feet away now, the heat so intense it was hard to breathe. Nora understood his plan. He wasn't trying to fight the fire anymore. He was trying to bring the river to them. She grabbed a shovel and started digging alongside him, her muscles screaming in protest. They dug like madmen, tearing at the earth, while Luca huddled behind them, sobbing in terror. The fire singed the back of Nora's dress. An ember landed in her hair, and she frantically beat it out. They were running out of time. With a final desperate roar, Toshin swung the axe deep into the mud and roots beneath the cottonwood trees. For a moment, nothing happened. The fire surged closer, a wave of incandescent death. Then, with a low groan, the earth began to shift. A crack appeared in the ground. The river, cheated of its bank, surged sideways. A torrent of muddy, churning water erupted from the ground, flooding the clearing, hissing and steaming as it met the wall of fire. The water poured around them, dousing the flames that had surrounded the cabin. It was a miracle, a muddy, chaotic, beautiful miracle. They collapsed in the mud and ash, soaked and exhausted, as the flood waters turned the inferno into a smoldering, steaming ruin. They were alive, battered, homeless, but alive. As dawn broke, casting a pale, sickly light over the devastated landscape, they saw riders approaching. It was the sheriff, and behind him, looking smug and triumphant, was Virgil Kane. "Well, well, Toshin," the sheriff said, not even bothering to look at the destruction. "Looks like you had a little accident. Playing with matches, were you?" "It was Kane," Nora said, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "We saw him." The sheriff laughed. "Mr. Kane was with me all night, Missy, playing poker. I've got a dozen witnesses." "An alibi." Of course he had an alibi. Kane dismounted, a cruel smirk on his face. "Such a shame about your little home. But don't you worry." He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. The letter. Nora's letter. "According to this legal contract, this young woman is my betrothed. I'm just here to collect my property and take her somewhere safe." He reached for Nora's arm. "No," she said, pulling away. "The law is on my side," Kane said, his voice hardening. He looked at the sheriff. "Isn't that right?" The sheriff nodded, his hand resting on his gun. "The lady will go with Mr. Kane." It was over. He had won. He had destroyed their home, tried to kill them, and now he was going to take her, with the full protection of the law. Toshin, bruised and burned, slowly got to his feet. He stood between Nora and Kane, a silent, immovable object. "She's not going anywhere," he said. "You have nothing left, savage," Kane sneered. "Your home is gone. You're standing on my land. You have lost." "You burned the wrong thing," Toshin said, his voice dangerously low. He pointed to the smoldering ruins of the barn. Amidst the blackened timbers, something glinted in the morning sun. It was a small, metal tin. "What is that?" the sheriff asked, squinting. "That," Toshin said, his eyes never leaving Kane's, "is the tin of special lamp oil Mr. Kane favors. The kind he has shipped in from St. Louis. The kind that burns hotter and faster than anything else." Kane's face went pale. "I imagine," Toshin continued, "that if you were to look at the bottom of that tin, you'd find his initials. VC. He puts them on everything he owns." The sheriff, for the first time, looked uncertain. He glanced from the tin to Kane, whose smug arrogance had finally evaporated, replaced by a flicker of panic. Luca, seeing her chance, darted past the men and scrambled into the wreckage. She came back holding the hot tin with a piece of cloth, her face triumphant. She held it out to the sheriff. There on the bottom, clearly stamped into the metal, were the initials. V.C. Kane had been so sure that all the evidence would be destroyed in the fire. He had underestimated the one thing he could never understand: Toshin's deep knowledge of this land, his observant eyes, his refusal to be broken. The sheriff stared at the tin, then at Kane's terrified face. The town might be prejudiced, the law might be crooked, but this was evidence. Hard, undeniable evidence of arson and attempted murder. "Virgil Kane," the sheriff said, his voice suddenly official and cold. "You're under arrest." Kane was stunned into silence as the sheriff pulled out a pair of handcuffs. The invincible rancher, the man who owned the valley, was brought down not by a gun or a fistfight, but by a small tin box and the quiet man who refused to run. As they led a sputtering, protesting Kane away, Nora looked at the ruins of her home, at the muddy, scarred earth. They had lost everything, but they had won. She walked over to Toshin, who stood watching the riders disappear. Luca came and stood between them, taking both of their hands. "What do we do now?" Nora whispered, tears of relief and exhaustion tracing paths through the soot on her cheeks. Toshin looked at the 3 small cottonwood trees, their roots now exposed but holding firm, their leaves reaching for the sun. "Now," he said, squeezing her hand, "we build." And so they did. The town, shocked by the arrest of its most powerful citizen, began to see things differently. Folks who had once crossed the street to avoid Toshin now offered a hesitant nod. Some even brought food and tools to help them rebuild. They had not just exposed a criminal, they had broken the spell of fear that Kane had cast over the valley. With the help of their neighbors, they built a new cabin, stronger and better than the first, right by the 3 cottonwood trees that had saved their lives. One day, standing by the river, Toshin took Nora's hands. There was no preacher, no crowd, just the sun, the river, and Luca, who stood as their witness, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. "I came here with nothing," Nora said, her voice thick with emotion. "But you saw me, not as a broken thing, but as someone whole. I promised to see you the same." "I never thought I'd belong anywhere," Toshin said, his voice carrying a depth of feeling she had never heard before. "But I belong here, with you. I promise to stay even when it's hard, especially then." They adopted Luca officially, giving her a home and a family. Nora, with her Eastern education, became the new teacher at the Dust Devil schoolhouse. Months later, as winter settled over the valley, Nora told Toshin she was pregnant. He was silent for a long moment, his hand resting on her belly in wonder. "I never thought I would be a father," he whispered. "I never thought I would be a mother again," she replied. He looked at her, his eyes full of a love that needed no words. "You were never not one," he said. They had a son, a beautiful dark-haired boy they named James. One afternoon, Nora sat on her porch, watching Toshin hold their son, humming a low, Apache lullaby. Luca was reading a book on the steps, her bare feet tapping out a rhythm. The 3 cottonwood trees stood tall and strong by the riverbank. She had come to this place seeking an escape, but she had found something so much more. She had found a home, built not on promises, but on presence, not on lies, but on a hard-won truth. She thought about all the other women back east, reading ads in newspapers, dreaming of a new life, women running from their own fires. She went inside and began to write a letter. "Dear Miss Ellery," she wrote, "you don't know me, but I once answered a letter like yours. The man who met me wasn't what I expected. He was quieter, stronger, and more broken than I could have imagined. But he was also more whole. There are no chandeliers here," she continued, "only dust, hard work, and the clean, honest truth. Marriage isn't a rescue. It's a river you cross with someone who will carry your weight when you can't. Go west if your heart pulls you. But don't expect it to be easy. Just expect it to be real." She signed it, not Nora Whitman, the woman who ran from a fire, but Nora Gray, the woman who had learned how to build in the ashes. The thing about the desert is, it doesn't give you what you want. It gives you what you need. It strips you down to your bones and shows you what you're really made of. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it gives you a place to plant your roots and grow. If this story of courage and redemption resonated with you, and you want to hear more tales about the moments that define us, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world and allows me to keep finding and sharing these incredible stories. Thank you for listening.